This is from chapter 13. It's called Tutu, which means caribou in Inupiaq. Anyways. I straddled a roaring snow machine and grasped my arms around the driver in front of me. Eben, an Arctic youth ambassador visiting Guavdegednu from the North Slope of Alaska. Tuoma from Guavdegednu led the two of us and 4 other ambassadors on a team of snow machines over frozen lakes toward his reindeer herd. The students I traveled with had flown to Sapmi from all over Alaska, from the southeast to the Aleutian Islands. The Arctic Youth Ambassadors Program selected teenage students to travel in the USA and abroad to bring awareness about life in Alaska. In Sapmi, I met other Alaskans with deeply personal reasons for educating others about the drastic effects of climate change. Like a metro in the city, thick ice is essential for safe travel in communities around the circumpolar Arctic. Where there are no connecting roads between people and their food, people travel by sled dogs and snow machines to traverse lakes, mountains, bays, and marshes. Ice used to rain around the Arctic Ocean 8 months of the year near the 1970s. But now, Arctic ice is much less reliable than a subway timetable. It was early January, and the sun hadn't yet shown itself far north for the last 2 months. The dim winter light shone blue on the snow as far as the eye could see, with only twisted, slender trees standing above the Duotar, the tundra. Helmets protected us from the wind. Parkas, pants, and boots shielded from the cold. It was minus 16 degrees Celsius out. I wore a wool sweater, long johns, chunky knit stockings, 2 pairs of thick socks, snowsuit overalls, and a heavy coat with a black face mask that covered everywhere but my eyes. I was so bundled in layers that I didn't have a full range of motion. I had gone snow machining on frozen lakes a handful of times on New Year's, but I'd never had a snow machine of my own. I didn't normally do outdoor activities in the winter before college. Instead, I spent hours after school every day in the at debate practice. As my mom liked to tell her family in Tennessee, our life was not like Sarah Palin's Alaska. In 18-year-old Eben Hobson's Alaska, a snow machine was crucial for food security. Like his Inupiaq ancestors before him, Eben provided food for many families in his community by hunting caribou, whaling twice a year, and fishing in the summer. Whenever Eben was not working or at school, he was either actively hunting or prepping equipment. Hunting required hours at a time spent on the land. Every morning, he woke up early to go outside, check the weather, and plan his day based on how the sky, wind, and temperature felt. A new snow machine to traverse the land would be too expensive, but he saved up over months to buy a used one and used his experiential knowledge and mechanics to keep it running. I felt safe with him driving. Face pressed against his weatherproof back, I absorbed the Arctic scene zooming past in the indigo blue sky above us. A smile bloomed under my mask as I imagined how green and purple aurora would light up the moon around night. The cold blasting into my body and the scenery before my eyes made me feel giddy. Nothing could be heard over the deafening sounds of the machine underneath us and wind howling past our ears. For at least 24 minutes of our drive, I belted my best Alicia Keys impression into the back of Evan's head. Then I tried to remember as many words as I could to Drake's nonstop. Evan kept his focus on the trail and thumb on the throttle, unaware of my personal concert. Suddenly, the Ski-Doo nose-dived into a steep bank on the semi-frozen lake. The song drained from my lungs as my stomach lurched toward my mouth. My jaw clenched and I held on tight as the snow machine bucked over the liquid, snowy bank. Eben let off the throttle for a moment and the 2 skis at the front floundered under an inch of water. Up ahead, we could see the other ambassadors were safely crossing, spraying trails of water behind them. Eben regained his nerve, leaned over the handles as he fed the snow machine gas. The track whirred as its gears ground into the slush. The key to crossing successfully was never slowing down, because if he did, the thin lake ice might crack and engulf us in freezing water. At 16 degrees below 0 Celsius, it was warmer in January than Eben was used to. At home in Utqiagvik, Alaska, the northernmost town in North America, winter dipped to -50 without wind chill. The sea ice on the North Slope froze the ocean up to the shore in late December and only reached slushy temperatures during spring breakup season. But with a football field's worth of ice shrinking from the Arctic each month, traveling over ice had become increasingly dangerous. Snow machines were known to fall through the open water between cracks in the ice, and underwater, it would only take 3 minutes to die from hypothermia. Within those few terrifying moments, the machine gained traction again and zoomed over the lake. Once we made it across, we paused a few minutes to calm. "Are you okay?" He turned his head to ask, remaining seated on the machine. "I'm okay," I said. "I trust your driving. Are you?" He was quiet for a moment. "The last time I drove a snow machine, I had a really bad accident," he said. Just a few months before, the ice had suddenly given way beneath him. It was terrifying because every Inuk knows someone who has fallen through the ice and died. Many of those people were experienced, lifelong hunters, yet recent ice loss made travel unsafe in traditional and familial hunting areas. In the last 2 generations, over 70% of sea ice on the Arctic Ocean has rapidly disappeared. Over 200 Alaskans died from falling through the ice from 1990 to 2010, with Indigenous people passing away at more than 4 times the rate of all Alaskans. The reason for this discrepancy was that Alaska Native people traveled over their land more frequently and at longer distances in order to provide food. For a subsistence hunter, it was crucial to bring back sustenance for the community. Eben shook out his arms and took a deep breath. "Something I heard," he said. "No matter what happens, never stop going out on the land." Despite the risk to traversing the melty, icy landscape, it was important to him to practice and preserve the culture. After all, his grandfather's name, Eben Hobson, decorated his local middle school in big, bold letters. Eben's grandfather was the very first mayor of Barrow, now called its Inupiaq name Utqiagvik. He was also the founder of the Inuit Circumpolar Conference, the largest and oldest representative body of Inuit people across Russia, Alaska, Canada, and Greenland. Archaeological evidence shows that Inuit have been hunting whales and seals in Eben's region for at least 13,800 years. That's an order of magnitude longer than the Stonehenge, Colosseum, pyramids of Giza, and Eastern Island statues have been on Earth, and 2 orders of magnitude longer than the Great Wall of China. Eben had never traveled abroad before this trip and had been anxious about traveling so far from Alaska. But when he got out to the tundra, it felt like the Arctic, like home. The purpose of the Arctic Youth Ambassadors Exchange was to expose the Alaskans traveling abroad to the challenges reindeer herders face due to climate change. The takeaway was a positive one, though. Indigenous knowledge is a powerful tool in adapting to climate change. We rumbled over lakes and tundra for another hour through the night day before Tuolma pushed on his brakes and raised his deer hide mitten into the freezing air. The 5 of our snowmobiles powered down the edge of the clearing. "Too much noise would scare his herd off," he said. He silently pointed toward a few black specks beyond a snowy drift. By now it was afternoon, and the stars began to shine through the navy indigo ceiling. The snow reflected all the light it found and showed up a dusty blue, darkened by the shadows of child-sized shrubs. When my eyes adjusted, I saw reindeer kneeling their snouts into the snow. Somewhere in the distant back of the field, a few hundred reindeer munched for food. I narrowed my eyes to focus in on the herd, but ice shone off the ends of my eyelashes and almost blocked my view. Tuolma said, "The harsh, cold inland is better for grazing." He typically used few words, unless he had a joke to tell. If it wasn't 16 below, he probably would have been rolling a cigarette with his bare fingers. Since I'd last seen him, Tuolma had herded his reindeer 500 kilometers north from Rainoia Island. His family would have led them on foot or sled in the past, but Norwegian urbanization along the traditional path made that impossible. Beginning every December, Tuolma loaded his family's thousands of deer onto cargo shipping trucks and drove them north along the highway. It was mid-January now, and the reindeer had been grazing in northwestern Finnmark for a month. Then I'll just skip forward a little bit. In this part, he's showing us how he's, actually, never mind, I'll read. Okay. He said, "Come look, there are layers in the snow." Tuoma reached into the hole. He started to kick a hole in the snow with his foot. He reached in the hole and shook a layer of snow, packed in soft and powdery. This was good grazing, Tuoma told us. The type of snow reindeer could munch through. Reindeer have to eat all year round, of course, even in winter. Their tough snouts dug down into the snow to get frozen lichen and other freezer section treats. The reindeer herder's job was to lead them towards such accommodating snow patches. He then cracked a layer of crunchy, crystalline snow off the top of the blanket and said, "We call this sugar snow in Michaela." Using his mother tongue, Tuoma drew out each syllable of the word like molasses. Sugar snow, he explained, came from rainfall in winter. When rain turned existing snow into crystalline ice, it created a hard layer, and the reindeer snouts couldn't penetrate it. This is why good grazing is important, Tuoma continued. Good grazing means food is accessible. When ice forms a layer over the snow, reindeer can't access the frozen lichen. Along the coast, like in Tromsø, rains occurred all winter long. Inland, the temperature stayed below 0 degrees Celsius during winter and left little possibility for rain. But unfortunately, warmer temperatures are leading to more rain on snow events in Arctic winters. Ice formation from rain on snow is associated with catastrophic mass starvation of reindeer herds. These reindeer were in the heart of winter pastures, where they could normally dig through the dry snow and snack on frozen lichen all winter long. But rain had been here recently, and that wasn't normal. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says, quote, "Restrictions affecting the movement of reindeer to pastures are expected to negatively interact with the effects of climate and affect the future sustainability of herding systems across the Arctic region," end quote. Essentially, climate change is making reindeer herding harder, but government policies and land conflicts set up many of the barriers to adaptation. In the past, reindeer herders could lead their herds to better grazing areas, but northern Norway has become more industrialized, and personal implementation plans, which are required for reindeer herders, limit the locations where herds can legally graze. Some families, less fortunate than Tuoma's, used to utilize winter pastures in Finland and can no longer herd there legally because of border restrictions. Now, herders lay food pellets on the ground when they can't access good grazing in pastures. Food pellets are not the traditional way. Since reindeer traditionally fed on local foliage, feeding them pellets was less sustainable and resulted in a different quality meat. That really hurt because ensuring high quality meat meant everything to a serious herder like Tuoma. Ebben's livelihood had also been affected by climate change. In addition to dangerous cracks in ice and open water, the loss of year-round sea ice has caused major storms to rack the coastline. Back in the 1970s, high winds and strong ocean currents pushed thick ice sheets together to form towering Evenik, similar to the way magma pushes tectonic plates together to form mountains. These icy pressure ridges used to be 3 or 4 stories tall and block the coast from storms. In the last few years, 10 to 15-foot waves have flooded beaches around Ebben's town. The 2 major roads he used to haul his fishing and hunting equipment from in late spring to early fall are now wiped away. One is completely underwater. Without access to the best spots, fishing and hunting would be poor this coming season. Does that impact people's ability to eat? I asked Ebben. I recalled that grocery store milk was $8 a gallon because of exorbitant shipping costs to reach the North Slope, and most rural Alaskan households relied on subsistence. Yes, definitely, Ebben told me. Our food security depends on traditionally sourced foods. Inupiaq traditionally stored their catch in an underground cellar called sigluaq. making use of year-round permafrost. Eben said he notices more rainfall every year, and in the early summer, relentless rain floods the underground cellars and thaws the permafrost as well as the food. Bowhead whale intended to feed a family through the winter would be lost, and there would be 7 months of winter before the community could renew their seasonal quota. Since 1979, the Alaska Eskimo Whaling Commission has been tasked with proving how many whales can sustainably be caught. Even today, seasonal quotas are established with data from Kalunwak, primarily white outsiders, who fly in to counter the Inupiaq data with anthropological assessments. Like Tuoma's herding, Eben's whaling was made even more difficult by restrictions. The world's inaction on climate change, compounded by government regulations, has resulted in tangible losses for Arctic providers. Meanwhile, high carbon dioxide emitters pay nothing to compensate for their externalities. Externality is an economic term that describes side effects caused by producing or consuming a good which impact third parties not directly related to the transaction. For example, neither the passengers, the airline, nor the fueling company are required to pay for the carbon dioxide emissions caused by a long-haul flight, but Arctic residents' food security is threatened nonetheless. People with the smallest carbon footprints, who produce their sustenance from the land around them, are most impacted by climate change. A lot of people subsequently assume that climate change will be the demise of Arctic indigenous peoples. But that is not what I took away from spending time with people who herd reindeer or lead subsistence lifestyles. I noticed how much specific knowledge they have about the Arctic environment, down to very small differences in snow texture. Even the IPCC says, quote, "The tightly coupled relationship of northern local communities and their environment provide an opportunity to better understand climate change and its effects, support adaptation, and limit unintended consequences," end quote. The world has a lot to learn from indigenous peoples about the impacts of climate change, as well as ways to mitigate carbon emissions. In the Amazon rainforest, for example, indigenous territories reduce deforestation twice as fast as government protected nature areas. Indigenous peoples' control over their own lands is very important for our planet's future. Okay, that's where I'll stop.
So there are some questions that are very broad that I think that we could maybe get into. And also, that particular passage was very much centered around this idea that is ringing in my head, land back.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious what you know about the land back movement, both domestically, and then you have an international background as well. So if you could speak a little bit to that movement.
I'm very inspired by that movement. I don't know if you all have heard of land back before. Basically, it's just the idea that indigenous peoples want their land back. And I think often I noticed in North Carolina, and I think in places like here in DC, people often tend to think of indigenous peoples as not having existed recently, or, we're often told that they don't exist. And when you come from a place like Alaska, you just know that that's not the case, where, at least 20% of people living there are indigenous. But it's all over the world that this land back movement is relevant. And in the climate context, when you read a book like this, there's this statistic that although indigenous peoples only make up 5% of the world's population, they protect 80% of its biodiversity. Like 80% of our world's biodiversity is in indigenous controlled lands. And that just shows you how critical it is to support indigenous people's leadership, especially when it comes down to environmental sustainability, but really more broadly than that. I mean, if you ask someone like Eben or the chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, Daily Sambo Duro, she'll say that Indigenous people's leadership is really crucial to all aspects of policy making, and not just environmental, but definitely environmental.
Yeah. And another concept that particular chapter touches on is this concept of borders, and how these concepts limit the capacity of people to adapt. And from a societal perspective, there's a quote that I remember from a different chapter, I think, where you mentioned this concept of land ownership being a Western ideal, something that needs to shift. And this kind of goes to one of the questions that is the third question, but I think it's okay to do them out of order here, which is, how does climate advocacy become more widespread, and what needs to change in society and government? And I'm curious what your take is on borders.
Yeah. Well, borders as we know it, like of the nation states today, really only came about after the end of the world wars. And I think that's something that is really important to put in context, is that we think of them as, how could they not exist? But they really didn't up until the past few decades, and at least in the way that we know them today. And when the nation state borders were created, this was a whole process in the UN where, certain countries have more privilege over other countries. And in particular, when you look at a map of Africa, for example, there's so many straight lines, right angles. And in fact, those borders had nothing to do with the identity of the people who live there. And so I think when we're talking about borders, and you're talking about identity, ethnicity, nationality, a lot of us in this room would probably think of ourselves as American, and that's because of the borders that we live within. But like in Alaska, for example, there are multiple peoples who have family members that are crossing over the Alaska-Canada border, and that border came in after the fact of their identity that's been in the process for thousands of years. And so in this case, where we talk about in Sápmi, where families are living across Finland, Norway, and actually Sweden. I was once at the place where Sweden, Finland, and Norway all intersect, and you could like straddle all three countries. They're very different, the borders over there, than they are here. Like here we have border patrol, and that's a big part of American policy at the moment, is border making. But like in that place where Norway and Finland are crossing, there's not even anybody manned there often. There might be like a station, and there's a red light, and you just either stop or you go through the light. And so the idea is that these borders, we are making them all the time with our policies, and that in fact they stop people from being able to lead sustainable lifestyles. They strip people from their identity when they're not able to be in touch with their family that's right across the border. And so I hope that answered your question. What was the third question again?
So that third question is a more broad question, which is, how does climate advocacy become more widespread, and what needs to change in society and government?
Yeah, one thing I talk about is cross-border collaboration is really important. And this is something that I've been doing in this international, field. At the Polar Institute, I started this initiative called the Arctic in 25 Years, which gathers youth from across the circumpolar north, from all 8 Arctic countries. That's Russia, Canada, the USA, Finland, Sweden, Norway, Iceland, and which one am I missing? What? Oh, Denmark, which is Greenland. And basically getting them together to talk about their shared concerns, and also being able to talk about their shared potential solutions, because actually there's a lot of similarities across the circumpolar north. Like I talk about, there's been a lot of similar policies that have been adopted to try to, change the way of life, either turn nomadic peoples into peoples who are living in a stationary place so they can pay taxes, or otherwise try to control traditional lifestyles. And so by getting people from across the many countries to talk to each other about their similar and also different situations, perhaps they can come up with solutions as well, to these environmental problems, which, as we know, don't stay contained within borders. Like the bowhead whale, like we talked about, travels north-south thousands of miles, down to Mexico and California and back. And so we can't really solve these international environmental problems in our own borders. They have to be they have to result from collaboration across borders.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Another question that we have to get into are what are some policies and actions and issues that the average person should know with regards to climate action that are current?
If you read my book, the main thing I think that comes across is that if you want to solve environmental problems, you have to have an intersectional lens. I think often I talk about this in the book too, often stereotypes modern day, when we imagine environmentalists, we imagine white people. And often in places like government agencies like NOAA or others, it is primarily white people who are doing this environmental work. And actually this comes from the modern foundations of what we know as environmentalism today, like Henry David Thoreau and those writers who really started the environmental movement in the late 1800s, imagine wilderness as spaces where people from the upper class, from the cities, could leave and enjoy in their free time. And that had to be untouched nature, is what wilderness was. But in fact, that's kind of a fallacy, that the reason why we have such beautiful biodiverse nature spaces is often because of the indigenous peoples who have been living there and stewarding it. At least in Alaska, that's certainly the case. And, we've seen in California with the wildfires that don't touch it is not a good solution, because it caused a bunch of dry brush and old wood that wasn't able to sustain itself. And then you have these long sustained fires over long periods of time. So it's really important to recognize that maybe these environmental policies that we're making are not the best ones because the right people are not in the room, and that we need to be able to have a more expansive dialogue with people from different worldviews and often from indigenous worldviews, people who have a strong connection and knowledge about the place that they're from, if we're going to create good environmental solutions. So the actual specific policies, I think, comes from, for one, consultations. This is something that's known in places where you have a lot of indigenous peoples, like in Alaska, but might be kind of a newer concept here, is like meaningful engagement of communities. And so, yeah, that would be one way in order to integrate these sorts of knowledge systems that currently aren't integrated to the extent that they should be.
Yeah. And if I may add on some of the very hypercurrent things in the activist community around this area, there was a week of actions called People versus Fossil Fuel that took place, I believe, 2 weeks ago today. And it was an indigenous-led several occupations throughout the downtown area. The police showed more brutality than I have seen. Usually the police downtown for these like environmentalist ones, or like, because a lot of times in the past it has been primarily white people, you see less police brutality, and then you see the opposite when we're talking about indigenous led occupations of the Department of Interior, which is
their department.
their department. Yes, their department. And even when they have the first indigenous woman in office there, which is, I hate to say I'm not surprised, but like it's all a part of the same broad
the system itself didn't change.
Yeah. And kind of a hard question that I grapple with is, we all have to function inside of this assumption that expansion is possible always, infinite expansion. That's like one of the founding principles of economics that, in my opinion, makes no sense. And when we're functioning inside of that, once we, like, let's say that we do give land back to people, are we still going to fall into that same pattern? What do you think would change? And what would give you hope if we saw more land given back to Indigenous people and more elevated leadership?
Yeah. That was good that you brought up that. I actually saw the flyer for the fossil fuels or people over fossil fuels. And there's this interesting report that came out that was showing that there's a lot of direct action that Indigenous peoples have pioneered against, especially pipelines that are carrying fossil fuels. You might see them in the news in Canada. Also in Alaska, there's ANWR, for example, that there's that big fight over the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge in order to open it up for drilling, which Alaska, the state of Alaska, has been very gung-ho about. There's the big fight with Trump and Biden, and but actually it's really been Indigenous peoples who have been at the forefront of stopping ANWR from being opened to development. And that there is this ethic of reciprocity with the environment and care for the environment that often comes in many different Indigenous cultures. And the idea is that, if I am eating the whale that's in the water, then why would I pollute the water? And it's this, there is this also like stories that people have passed down, not traditional knowledge people have passed down through their languages over generations, that those stories often tell about ways to care for the environment. So one is Sasua Arna, who is a sea goddess for Inuit across the circumpolar north. The story is told a little bit differently in different communities. Her name might be different and things like that. But the idea is that she is on a kayak. She gets thrown, which is a traditional type of boat. She gets thrown from her kayak, her fingers get cut off, and then these fingers become all the relatives in the sea that sustain life. So salmon, whales, etc. And when her waters get polluted, then she wraps her hair around all the animals and doesn't let them go. So then hunters can't find food. And so you have to bring medicine men to her in spirit, and primarily you have to cleanse the waters in order to bring back the animals. So, that's like one of the foundational stories of in that culture. And it talks about how you need to, if you don't see food and the waters are polluted, then you need to clean the waters. Versus, like you say, an ethic of economic growth that is unending. If you're seeking profit at least cost around the world, you're likely going to be creating like exploitative policies. And so one of the things I talk about in the book is that if we want to create better policy, that's not really just a simple policy solution sort of thing, it really does go down to your worldview and the cultures that you're bringing to the table. And that if it's not a diverse table, and if you're not allowing Indigenous peoples to have the say that they need to the point that they're, occupying the Department of the Interior building, then you're probably not going to be having very sustainable policies coming out of it.
Yeah. Do you have any advice for us how to differentiate between somebody who is put in a place of power as a figurehead and tokenized and ends up being a tool of the system at large, versus how to suss out who is really rooted in the cultural community that they're a part of?
Oh, that's a good question. I think part of it is for one, you have to build like authentic relationships within a community. Like if you often see with research, for example, that researchers will come into a community and find someone who's willing to talk to them and then use that story and say, okay, this is what Indigenous people say. And that in fact, that person might not be a traditional knowledge holder. And this is getting into politics that like, it's not my place to say either, right? Like I didn't say this at the beginning, but my dad is Black, my mom is white. Dad was raised in Alaska. My mom was raised in Tennessee and moved to Alaska. And so, I can't say either this person is legit and this person's not legit. But that is something for the community to decide. And often there still are these traditional governing councils where they do have the authority to say X, Y, and Z, and also nominate people from their community who they feel have the ability or the legitimacy to represent them as people. And so that would, yeah. And also like having worked at the Indigenous Peoples Secretariat, they have, 6 organizations there that are very good, reputable organizations. If ever you're looking for people to talk to about these things.
Great. One of the questions is, how would you encapsulate the urgency of the climate crisis? And that's a very serious question.
Yes. I mean, you guys got one of the best kind of descriptions of the actual tangible changes that are happening in the Arctic. But a little facts for you is the Arctic is warming at 3 times the rate of the global average. So, the COP26 is happening right now. This is a conference of the parties that are trying to keep global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. But the Arctic has raised 3 to 4 degrees Celsius already. And the global average has raised 1.3 degrees Celsius. So it's very unlikely that we'll keep to 1.5. It's also quite unlikely we'll keep to 2 degrees Celsius. And to encapsulate that, the last ice age was only 6 degrees colder Celsius on average than in pre-industrial times. So if you think about if we do make to 4 degrees Celsius of global warming, that is a world that we can't imagine today. It would look very different than it currently does. And we know that climate change is not the only problem. We're living in this epoch called the Anthropocene, which means that humans are the largest force on the environment than anything else. And so that includes global temperature rise. It also includes mass extinction, the 6th great mass extinction, and biodiversity loss, as well as drastic land use change, in which we're changing from forests to cities and essentially just sculpting the face of the earth. And that has a huge effect on our ability to continue living here sustainably. for the future. So it's a very difficult, and I've just seen it in my lifetime. Like I talk about in the book how we always had snow by Halloween in Alaska. Like we had to design our Halloween costumes around our snowsuits, and I was a pumpkin, then I was a fluffy tiger, and that was always going to happen. And then in 2016, 2018, 2019, now in 2021 and in 2020, there was no snow on the ground in Anchorage. And beyond just the temperature change, I've seen like the first Walmart come to Anchorage. And now we have all these fast food restaurants that didn't exist. And there used to be a bog next to my childhood home, and now it was redeveloped for, suburban housing. So it's really important to think. One of the takeaways from the book is about just the interconnectedness of things, and like evaluating your relationship with the environment around you. Like when I moved here to DC, and I went out to the Navy Yard, and it's very beautiful and stuff, but the river is dead. There's like very little, there's all the plastic, there's all the yucky color in the water. And like, would you want to eat a fish out of that? Then think about like, that's what we're doing to the planet, and we're making it happen all the time, unfortunately.
Yeah. Some of the concepts in the book, this is very much an anti-racist piece of work. And in unlearning white supremacy, a huge amount is taking a step back, saying we need to stop prioritizing these concepts of expansion. Even efficiency is something that, and the Roberts Rules of Order, these systems that are designed to silence people. And that efficiency and speed with which development can happen under this societal construct of white supremacy. There's this interesting and terrifying dynamic of, if we don't act with urgency to address the climate change, if we don't tackle it very, very quickly, how are we supposed to move very quickly when we also desperately need to unlearn white supremacist
Yeah, we also need to do
culture?
it right.
Yeah, like that's kind of an impossible question, but it's something that weighs on my mind, and I'm wondering if you have any thoughts that you might want to share about
that. Just to kind of, I kind of expand the definition of white supremacy in the book than what you might have normally read. I'll pull it up right now, actually, because there's a glossary. White supremacy, the belief that white people are superior to other races and should dominate society. That's like the traditional dictionary definition. White supremacy is also the reality that white people currently occupy disproportionate power, privilege, and wealth. For example, in the United States, white people make up 92.6% of Fortune 500 CEOs, over 80% of nonprofit directors, and 88% of senior executive service members in the federal government, which is, far more than the percentage of white people that there are in American society. And so my argument is that if we all come to the table with different worldviews, and if 80% or more of our leaders in American society come with white worldviews, then we are not getting the diversity, the representative government really that we've promised ourselves. And that in places like, we're not really acting with the urgency that perhaps we would like to see, but an example is in Norway. They are acting with a lot of urgency in order to address climate change. They're trying, I don't remember the exact percentage, but they have more ambitious climate goals with the rate they're trying to reduce their carbon emissions. And in the last year, they approved 91 applications for wind farms. And this is the 5 million person country. So compare that to, New York City or something. And so they have ratcheted up the pace at which they're trying to address climate change. However, of those 91 wind farm applications, 40% of them are in Sami indigenous homelands. And there's 25,000 Sami speakers in Norway. So they make up about 0.5% of the population. And so to get to what you were saying about, well, how do we address with the urgency, but then what are we missing out on really if we're not changing the system as we're doing it? Essentially, what's happening is that these most sustainable livelihoods that there are in Norway, the reindeer herding, are being decimated because of wind farms, because because they have approved wind farms in Sami reindeer herding lands. And on paper, it looks like these can coexist and the reindeer can still go with them. But Sami herders will tell you that no, the reindeer won't go anywhere near the wind farms because of the noise or vibrations or whatever. They won't. And they can't take their herd outside of the lands that they've previously designated on the forms, like I talked about, because that's just not legally allowed. And they can be punished for that. And so an entire family might lose their ability to herd reindeer every time a wind farm is put up. So they're moving at the urgency and at the same time losing the knowledge and the benefits, the ecological benefits that these sustainable livelihoods provide. And that's kind of where we're going here in America. We're wanting to build out our electric cars and build up our renewable energy infrastructure, which is good to a certain point. But if you're doing it in ways that are using least cost, capitalist and white supremacist frameworks, you might be doing it in lands that are, valued least, which are often Black and Indigenous people's lands. And we see how that works in America. Like in North Carolina, they have hog farms, for example. And these hog farms are really very gross. I've flown over them and seen just the open cesspools, basically. In these least cost capitalist white supremacist frameworks, often it's Black and Indigenous peoples who are put in the worst environmental conditions because it's the cheapest land, and they also have the least political power in order to fight against it legally. And so if we are just moving with the quickness in order to build up renewable energy, I think we're often going to have problems where we're going to be stepping on people's toes, and particularly people who've been marginalized.
COP26 is happening right now. Do folks in the audience know what that is? COP26. So it's, I'm seeing a shaking head. I forget do you remember what it stands
for? The parties.
Conference of the Parties. It's the 26th time that they've had a meeting to try to resolve climate change at a global scale. And it's going to be ending on 12th of November. And the United States has put nothing on the table when it comes to addressing the climate crisis. Biden has had ample opportunities to use executive power to stop Line 3. And just, I think 2 days after this conference ends, they're set to have a meeting to start leasing more federal lands, publicly owned lands, yeah. And I should say Indigenous lands also, more importantly, to fossil fuel interests to continue to draw out. And one of the things that is so infuriating is when you're talking about the Arctic Wildlife Refuge, the ice is melting, making it easier to access fossil fuels in the Arctic. And it's just creating this doom cycle.
Yeah.
So if you wanted to say anything to the world leaders, if you could get on the stage and say anything to them,
yeah,
what would you say?
Well, I was just reading something along these lines earlier today, and it really struck me. There was this graph that showed every time there's been one of these meetings and how the carbon emissions have just continued to go up linearly, and that nothing has really been done. And that it could be so easy. Like, really, one of the biggest problems in our society has to do with the global transportation of foods and goods, and that if we could relocalize our economies, that we could immediately reduce our carbon emissions, because the biggest contributor is transporting things, and it's also like these mass agro industrial farms and monocultures that we're creating all over the world are created by cutting down rainforests and replanting, big swatches of just one sort of thing, and that is not in fact good for the environment. And it does create the need then to ship it out to all sorts of different places, because you only grow this one thing here. And so I would say to the leaders, like, we already know what the solutions are often. It's moving back to relocalized economies. It's rebuilding indigenous and Black cultures and cultures that have been intentionally decimated. It's about, it's about moving it like more local power as well, and allowing people to have control over their local economies. And I don't think that those things would be something that you can really talk about on an international stage, because so much of our international global economy relies on, like you said, economic growth and having these monocultures. And so it would really take a complete change in our system that I don't think people, at least at that level, really want to see, unfortunately. So you had asked a question earlier about, like, how do we move into these different directions? And it will take a cultural shift, I think, and it'll also take, as I'm borrowing from someone else, like mass movements in order to convince our governments that this is actually what we want. Because currently they're able to continue on with this sort of colonial and white supremacist these large scale systems.
Mm-hmm. How are we on time? Should we take some audience questions now? Yeah.
Conversation. If you don't have a question, maybe if you just have like a reflection or something, and we can chat.
Also, for the folks watching at home, you can type your question into the chat and we'll read it out loud.
I have questions. Can you imagine any policy change or lifestyle change that would be palatable enough to happen?
Good question. I think that what needs to happen is some sort of shift in our representative democracy. And I think that's palatable because there's a lot of unrest in our country at the moment. I think a lot of people feel marginalized and want to be able to have some sort of greater say, but it's very clear that with voter ID laws and with, whatever else, gerrymandering, that we really don't have a say in our government that, like I said earlier, that we were promised to have. And so to go back to what I was mentioning about consultations, like consultations work to an extent, and oftentimes they're not meaningful. Like government will consult nation to nation with an indigenous government, and then the US government goes back and has, their notes taken about what was said, but often those things don't actually show up in policy. And so we need to have more robust and meaningful engagement frameworks when it comes to representation. And I think also what we miss in the United States is that we often talk about race, and race has been a very important shaping factor in the United States. When I was in Norway, people wouldn't talk to me about race because it was a very strange concept to them. But also there, people talked a lot more about like ethnicity and nationality and the parts of your identity that make up who you are, that aren't just the color of your skin. And, often ethnicity and race can overlap because, especially in America, policies have created social groupings based on the color of your skin. But we have a lot of cultures here in America that have, been developed over hundreds of years or thousands of years. And often we're seeing these being decimated because of these global, capitalist systems, and that we imagine, if you don't have a job in this town, you'll just move to another town and you'll move to the city and become part of that group. And people get stripped away from the knowledge that's been passed down over their generations, or get stripped away from their relationship to the place that they come from. And so I think that really growing acknowledgement of the cultures, the ethnicities that are in America, and having more robust engagement frameworks with those in order to have real representation would be something that I think we should move towards.
Abolish the Senate.
Don't tell anyone I said that.
I am serious. Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema suck. They're currently the two senators who are getting in the way of Build Back Better plan, which is already not enough. And they're trying to cut it even more, which is just ridiculous. So yeah, that's one of the things I think. And some things that come to my mind are thinking about ways to reestablish and following Indigenous leadership when it comes to reestablishing connection, really feeling connected with the land that we are spending our life on. And that includes thinking about what native plant species are not present that are edible, that we can forage, and how do we encourage those? Not planting a whole bunch of trees that only produce pollen and not fruits. There are these simple things that would make our society so much healthier and happier and more fun. And why we don't do these things blows my mind. The people in power, and oftentimes it's because I think there's when you actually find out how these systems work, and I made kind of a sort of tongue-in-cheek comment about Robert's Rules of Order, but it's you sit in these council meetings and it's we have time to make time for everybody to speak, but we don't have time to actually resolve problems. And really slow down and become grounded. And we haven't even, proud to say, we're on Piscataway Nation land.
That's important.
Right now, in Anacostan territory. And you should check out, I think I said this on the call, but you should check out Kenilworth Aquatic Gardens, because that is a spot where there is life. And it's so much more fulfilling than going to a zoo to see wildlife. It's oh no, there's just cranes everywhere. There's a blue heron. There's frogs jumping in the little lily ponds,
Yeah.
like as you walk by, and like tortoises, and it's just or like terrapins, and like it's just so grounding being in a space where people really took the time to develop that relationship. So
Yeah.
grow a garden if you can.
And I thought of another like kind of simple policy fix. This is more on the International Arctic Council stage. So like I said, there's the 8 Arctic states and there's the 6 indigenous organizations. I didn't name them all before, but that's the Russian Association of Indigenous Peoples of the North, Inuit Circumpolar Council, Sami Council, Arctic Athabascan Council, Gwich'in Council International, and the Aleut International Association. And as you can see, those are all related to either, like, you know, their people form, like they're representing their people there. They don't actually have voting power at the Arctic Council. So they sit all around the same table, and it's a consensus-based organization. So I was there at the meetings, and even though they don't have a vote, there is a lot of say that they have, and they can, you know, influence the states in certain ways. But unless the states actually agree with what they're saying and amplify what they're saying, then it doesn't get voted on, and it doesn't get any action associated with it. And so a pretty simple policy fix would be to allow voting rights for the indigenous organizations at the Arctic Council. But like I say in the book, I don't think that we're going to really have simple fixes if we're actually going to get to the root of the problem, that these really are cultural shifts that we need to be making.
Have one more question.
Is there like a culture shock from coming from Alaska to the 48 states here, like that was most surprising to you in terms of like how people interact with their surroundings? I just feel like there's a general ungratefulness for like where you are and like appreciating what you get from your environment.
Yeah.
Would you say that's like not something you experience at home coming to the United States? Landmass United States.
Mhm. the lower 48, as
Yes.
we call it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did. I think the immediate thing that comes to my mind is like littering. And that's not to say that people don't litter in Alaska. I'm sure people do. But it's my biggest pet peeve, right? Because I just don't understand, like, where do you think it's gonna go? It's gonna go in the water. It's gonna go it's gonna accumulate in the land, and like it doesn't make sense to me. But I think that, so I told this story once to my college roommate, and she was like, that's crazy. I remember, like, we were growing up fishing. My dad would take me out fishing. Like, we would go at 3 a.m. so that we could get there when the salmon started running, 5 or 6 a.m. And he would, I would kill the fish. I had a little baton that I would hit it on the head with, and he would fillet the fish. And so you get used to, I guess, that sort of environment. And there was once we were out on the beach, and this older lady, I remember, was teaching all of us little kids about salmon, and she like opened it up and took out the heart, and the heart was still beating, and the heart still beats for a few minutes after the salmon is filleted and passed away. And my friend was like, what? Like, you did what? even just the idea of it. And like, I was used to like people having just hunting and fishing and things like that. And I think that we are so separated from the environment here, down to the very like foods that we eat. And that's very much part of the American food system, is that you shouldn't really know what it comes from. And often I've heard, like, especially with fish in the supermarket, they're often mislabeled, and like, you can do a DNA test of the fish and it's not the fish that it says it is. And so I think that's the thing that really struck me, being down here, is like the stuff we put in our body is just toxic, and it's so normalized to the point that, like, if I talk about filleting a salmon and eating it, it's like, that's weird. But you know, that's so human. That's what life, and that's the circle of life, as the Lion King would say. And yeah. So that was the thing that was really surprising to me, and that I hope changes somehow. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks, Lost City Books, for
Thank you both. Thank you, Michaela. Thank you, Alice, for joining us this evening. This has been such a fascinating conversation. I'm so grateful that you were able to come out tonight. For anyone who does not have their book yet, we still have copies downstairs. You can grab them if you want to get it signed by the author herself while she's here.
I have my fancy signing pen.
Oh, please do, and take a look at our other books on environment and climate, which are scattered mostly in the environment section right there, but also a few more downstairs.
Thanks, Shady.